And finally, we've got a note from Sophie about talking about opportunities for cross-sector collaboration. We'll probably touch upon that more towards the end, but I'll make a note of it to make sure that we do. Awesome. All right, let's get kick started. I'm gonna try to just keep the chat open here up on the right in case you guys want to drop comments as we go. And if you want to speak and I have to unmute you, just throw a comment on the chat and then I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, we can check that off. Let's crack on. So obviously, to give you a little bit of context of who am I and why I can speak a little bit about this. I am a second-time founder. So I started my first company right out of university. I went to University of Southampton, where I did a degree in acoustical engineering. And while doing that degree, I started a company called Researchably, which was all about using the latest in artificial intelligence. You know, this was sort of like in the 2015 time when we started, when AI was really blooming. And it was about using AI to digest research papers and then help make sense out of them and use that information at scale. When we started the company, we really had no idea what we were doing. It was sort of one of those classic, you know, just a couple of people in a dorm room hacking things together. And we ended up, you know, going out to Silicon Valley to do an accelerator program called Berkeley Skydeck. We raised money from some amazing investors. We were able to deploy what ended up being an enterprise version of the technology that we had developed to help pharmaceutical companies do things like business intelligence, plan clinical trials, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an incredible experience where I learned a lot about, you know, how the startup world works, how to sort of build a team from 0 to 15, which was what we hit, how to sell to enterprise. But really, more importantly, what it taught me was that I wanted to go back to the roots of what I had always been interested my whole life, which was climate change and you know, caring for our planet, really. Building a startup is very, very hard, and it's hard to stay committed to something that you're not super passionate about. And so after stepping aside from Researchably, I knew that I wanted to work on something climate change related. And that's where Emitwise was born, which I'll tell you a little bit about today. And really the sort of like starting ethos behind Emitwise was just the idea of how can you build a massively impactful business, as big as some of the biggest companies that we've seen in the last couple of generations, whose entire goal is just to mitigate climate change. And very much understanding that the only way to do that is if you can make that business profitable by mitigating climate change, and trying to find that connection between profits and positive impact on the world. So what is Emitwise in a nutshell? Just to give you, once again, a little bit more context. We are basically software that helps businesses track their carbon footprint, so that they can then go and do something about it. They can reduce it in a continuous way. They can offset it in smart ways. But more importantly, they can actually begin by understanding it. We'll dive into all of the problems that lead us towards needing to achieve this, but just to give you a high-level overview, that's what Emitwise does. We work with medium and large businesses, and we essentially help them understand and manage their carbon footprint. Again, guys, please interrupt me with questions as we go, but you know, this is just to give you a little bit of a high-level overview. In terms of who we are as a company and sort of what we've gotten to so far, you know, we started in June of last year. That was sort of the birth of the idea, trying to move relatively quickly. My two co-founders also come from a background in tech startups. You know, Ben is a sort of mathematician, self-taught full stack engineer, and Ed and I are actually best friends from when we were kids growing up in Latin America. So it's been really great to be able to work alongside him. But none of us had actual sort of like hard expertise in the sustainability and carbon accounting side. So it's also been incredible to be able to bring on some amazing people like Caroline, who's our head of carbon accounting and has 12 years of experience in the space. And we've got these two incredible hires who unfortunately we can't disclose yet because they're still transitioning from an, you know, or one of them is still in another job and the other one's transitioning. And so I can't disclose them, but whatever. The big point is that they're experts in this space. And, you know, as technology people ourselves, it's really incredible to be able to work with people that actually understand this firsthand, you know, with decades of experience each. And finally, less interesting for all of this, but just to give you a bit of context about the company, we have some amazing investors in our cap table. We're honestly just like ridiculously lucky, but I think it also goes to show that there is a lot of appetite in this world for tech solutions to help battle climate change. And specifically in January and February of last year, as I'm sure you guys all saw, this was something that was exploding. That's us in a nutshell. Again, we can definitely come back and dive into the company a little bit more. But I thought today it would be far more interesting to talk about what is already happening in the world of corporate emissions management. I think sometimes a lot of people are not really aware that there is quite a bit of work happening, not just the typical work that you hear about on everyday news, but in the behind the scenes work. But of course, the second point that we'll touch upon is the fact that it's really not even remotely enough. And we need like very, very drastic transformational action. That's Emitwise, we think, is a part of that puzzle. Today, I will only focus on talking about our part of the puzzle, but I want to be very clear that we are very bullish that we need everything in the way of carbon capture. We need everything in the way of disruptive energy technologies like nuclear and continue advancing efficiencies in solar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are a part of the puzzle, which is a lot more about slowing down climate change and about buying us the time to be able to find those sort of disruptive solutions. And finally, a very important point that I think we should all walk away from today with is that there's this crazy thing that I've learned over the last couple of days, which is that the level of emissions reductions that we've seen because of COVID, with no one flying around, no one driving around, etc., is actually the level of emissions reductions that we need to stay on that 1.5 degree Celsius temperature reduction, increase, which is the target required in order to avoid sort of basically climate catastrophe or very, very, very severe climate change. And that to me is insane. I think it really highlights just how drastic the action that we need to have across the world in order to avoid severe effects of climate change. And I really hope that this is a call to action to everyone. Yeah, I've got a little wow on the chat. Yeah, yeah, correct, Alejandro. And I think for me, it really, I even as someone who's working on this every day, it's served as even a stronger call to action to show just how much we have to do. So that's sort of what I'm hoping to chat about today. Would love to share some more background on that after the meetup. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I have a nice screenshot of sort of the data that went into it, and I'll send you a link to a post where I learned that from firsthand. Thank you for your comment, Andy. I'm glad that's sinking in already, because I think it's a very powerful call to action, and I hope that we all walk away from here today feeling like, crap, I need to do a lot more. Cool, let's get kickstarted. So let's start with the good news, because when I was preparing for this last night, I was reading the brief, and this sentence really stuck with me. Businesses, we're told, are the ones doing the emitting, and they don't pay attention to how or how much. And I think this is something that I hear a lot from people that are not necessarily in the sustainability world, that they think that businesses just haven't cared at all, ever, or perhaps very, very, very little. And the reality is that, especially when you look at publicly listed companies, they have actually been looking at their environmental impact for, way over a decade. In fact, they've been required by law to publish their carbon footprint on their annual reports in the UK for, I think, 14 years now, something like that. And so there is actually quite a bit of work happening within these corporates already in the way of trying to understand the environmental impact and mapping it in this very helpful way, which is essentially equating it to the CO2 equivalent, the carbon footprint equivalent of their business. And good examples of this are, first of all, every FTSE listed company in the UK needs to publish an annual report with their sustainability data. But also, actually, the UK is very much at the forefront of this. There's this new legislation that just took effect in April of this year, called Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, SECR. And it actually forces 11,000 businesses in the UK, which are not listed, but have over 250 employees or meet a couple other set of financial criteria, to publish their carbon footprint for their first time ever. And that's absolutely huge. There's, to our knowledge, nowhere else in the world that requires businesses that are not public to that extent to report their carbon footprint. And the thing, as we'll dive into in a second, is that reporting your carbon footprint is really a very important and non-trivial step in actually doing something about the sustainability of your business. It forces you to look under the hood. It forces you to understand what you're doing to the planet. And so this is very, very meaningful. So we definitely need to disrupt this idea that businesses aren't paying attention. So SECR is enforced in the UK. I'm just getting for those that can't see the chat, I'm getting a question here in the chat. SECR is enforced in the UK. The problem is, of course, there's no financial penalties the first year. So we expect a bit of a lag until most companies that are affected will actually start reporting. But for example, one of the things that we did is make a free tool that makes it really easy to report for that, to encourage these businesses that previously wouldn't have been reporting to start reporting on this line. Keep the question coming, guys. So that's on one side, reporting is in full force, and companies have been looking at this for a decently long time. And also we have, you know, the classic cases, the IKEAs, the Unilevers, the ArcelorMittals of the world, which depending on what industry you operate, may be seen as sort of these businesses that have been really proactive when it comes to sustainability. And especially with companies like IKEA and Unilever, when you lift under the hood, you realize that they really are doing a lot already. Some would say that they're doing the best they can. Maybe they can push a little bit more. Even themselves sometimes say so, but they are very proactive. Of course, the problem is that is not the norm, right? It's by no means the standard. If every business was like Unilever, we would probably be in a much better position than we are today. And last but not least, everything that happened last year, we sort of call it the Greta effect as a joke internally. You know, the amount of momentum that the climate movement gained in December, January, and February was absolutely insane. And when, you know, we like, you know, personally, I have the privilege of, let me just finish this point and I'll jump into that discussion in the chat. You know, I have the privilege of talking to a lot of people that have been working on this space for 30, 40 years and have been waiting for this moment, you know, when things actually stepped up, and they have been losing hope. And so it's really incredible to see that sort of change. But it's, as I mentioned at the start, it is simply not enough yet, right? Slightly disjoint, but one of the things that I would be interested to discuss at some point is the emerging technology of tech giants. Blah, blah, blah. Ensuring carbon footprint requirements are for full innovation is not hidden. By the way, we can see the chat on the, we can't see the chat on the video, so it would be good if you repeat the points on the chat. Absolutely, Alejandro. Thank you for pointing that out. So Alejandro is saying that it would be good to chat about the impact of emerging technologies and tech giants, things like, you know, how much compute power all of the new deep learning models are using, or blockchain, on carbon footprints globally. And just to make a quick point about that, Alejandro, and when, if we have time at the end, we can dive into it. The reality is that while it's an important piece of the puzzle to keep an eye on, in terms of net terms, you know, the emissions associated with like streaming and cloud services are not very material, right? The where you can see the chat if you exit full screen. Let's see. Can you see it there? That's a good point. It's not just in the also yeah. Got it. Makes sense. Fantastic. And that's not to say that we shouldn't care about it, right? Like one of the things that we've learned is that we shouldn't just care about the emissions that are most material, because at the end of the day, things like understanding the emissions associated with cloud and computing services really engage people, right? Clearly, it was one of the areas that made you interested in what's happening in sustainability. And it's a little bit of a balance of focusing on the things that have the most impact. Like, you know, at the end of the day, the biggest emissions in our world come from heavy industry, from cement, from steel production, just from producing the electricity that runs our world, and burning coal. But there's also a lot of work you can do in the way of engaging people through things that are less material in terms of net impact. Yeah, absolutely. The textile sector in general, because of its water use and its use of chemicals, it's all equates to massive emissions. I'll plow through. I just wanted to show a quick example of like the type of, to demonstrate that businesses are really looking at this. This is just one page that I pulled through from a UK firm that publishes detailed sustainability data every single year. They have an annual report, a sustainability report, and a sustainability data report, which has 33 pages of just data. And that's one of thousands of companies, right? And so the reality is that this is data that companies are looking at, have been looking at for a while. So the question remains, so why do we not still have enough action, right? And we did a little bit of research when we were starting the company around that, and we were trying to look at what are the numbers that these companies are reporting. We scraped the PDFs of the sustainability reports of every FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 firm, and we looked at where were the net emissions they were reporting, were they changing year over year, were there discrepancies, all of these different things. And these graphs won't mean much to you, without diving deep into them. But this one was the most interesting one. What we found was that there was an outrageous amount of variability year to year in the emissions reported by a company, that if you saw that kind of changes in their financial numbers, that company would be in massive trouble with their board of directors if they didn't explain why that change had happened. Where does corporate travel fit into? Corporate travel fits into indirect emissions. So actually, it's not even a part of this graph, and I'll touch upon that in a second later down. It's all about indirect supply chain emissions. But what we learned from this analysis that we did was the notion that, well, the companies have the numbers, they're not being proactive about them, and they're not actually using them for management. They don't have sort of like real intelligence behind what those numbers are telling them. They're just using it for reporting in most cases, right? No vouching for these figures, but it does illustrate a simple point: visual capitalists. Piero, if I unmute you, why don't you tell us real quick what the numbers show, so that I don't have to pull the link up. Are you able to chat? Is it unmuted? Here we go.
You're muted, mate. Yeah, I think you just muted me.
Oh, I hear you now.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so one of the things that's interesting about work is that very much in Western Europe and in the US, this kind of ESG movement, right? This is about environmental, social, and governance. This is really what I do for a living. For a bank, is we look at these factors. But one of the things that's emerging is that, when you look at the big polluters, the really dirty polluters, we are looking at China and India, right? These are two countries that kind of are divorced from this whole ESG movement, right? And these guys, understandably, in a sense, are going hell for leather to industrialize, to kind of turn into service economies or whatnot. And so this ESG and everything you're talking about here, I think is really important, but it makes the Western Europe and America much cleaner, much more efficient, etc. But I haven't seen anything yet that kind of addresses how do you tackle things like India and China, where these kind of reports and governance don't actually make it a difference. The government doesn't care to some degree. India with its coal burning, etc. So I'd be interested to hear, what your points are on that.
Yeah, to be super transparent with you, Pierre, I'm by no means an expert in the Asian market. I know that China has put in massive amounts of investments in clean energy, but at the same time, they're also opening up new coal plants. So I know that it's one of those elements where it's rather controversial, right? What we've heard is that the biggest way to influence change when you can't affect things through, for example, ESG metrics, etc., is through supply chains, right? So if Unilever's has major suppliers in China, you bet your ass that they are going out there and auditing those suppliers from an environmental point of view. And if every company had that sort of that ethos of how they work with their suppliers and how they do sustainable procurement, then you could start enacting some level of change in that way. But by all means, I'm actually very interested to learn a little bit more about that side of the equation, Piero. I'll crack on. One of the important measures to get on Aisha is political cooperation and international agreements, like the Paris Agreement. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, once again, last year was one of those interesting years where we really saw corporates step up a little bit more than public organizations, especially with the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. And while the EU did push a couple interesting things, particularly the European Central Bank, in the way of sustainable financing. At the end of the day, most of the action that we saw was from the private world, in particular, things like BlackRock and the other largest private equity firms, their announcements around sustainable investments. So the major gap that we identified in regards to sustainability data is this notion of analytics. It's really very simple. It comes down to that idea that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Carbon tracking up until today has been an extremely manual, spreadsheet-driven process that was only for compliance purposes. These companies were looking at their carbon footprint for the sake of putting it on a report and forgetting about it. And until you actually give this information in a way that you can keep a pulse on it, that you can treat it the same way that you look at your sales data on HubSpot or your financials data on Zero, and you can use that data to make decisions and to embed sustainability into your day-to-day as an organization, then it simply doesn't do the job for you, right? And for us as a company, the really interesting thing was this shift from sustainability being a compliance and checkbox thing to it being a strategic requirement. The obvious opportunity was that companies were going to need to shift that status quo of how they were tracking their environmental impact, because they were going to actually have to start actively reducing their CO2, because shareholders were lifting under their hood and trying to understand what environmental impact was, because consumers were demanding that the businesses they purchase from are more sustainable, and employees as well, right? And so essentially what it boils down to is that because the businesses don't have good information around this, the efficiency of spending pounds on reducing your CO2 is, at its minimum right now. And there's a very, very high time sink into getting this data and getting value out of it. And it's hard to understand and communicate, as any data that is, sort of like living in spreadsheets is. Any technology people on the crowd, I'm sure, gets this is your bread and butter, right? And so to answer a question above of like sort of how, where does business travel live, to give you a super quick crash course into carbon emissions and carbon accounting, it's split into three things. It's all about what is going straight into the air if you're burning fuel. It's all about where you're using in the way of electricity, which is called scope 2, and then everything else in the way of your value chain, which includes how are the goods that you produce, how is their waste treated? Is it recycled or does it go to landfill? It includes your business travel. If you're a law firm, how much are you flying and catching, first class flights to meet clients? It includes, your transport of goods and services, everything else. This is really where the bulk of the interesting stuff happens. And as you can imagine, it's not very easy to track indirect emissions like that. The sustainability people in the crowd, I'm sure, recognize that. Anybody here ever done a carbon accounting exercise of their own, but out of curiosity? Like track the carbon footprint of a company or try to calculate their footprint of their, their personal life or anything like that? Not from your end. All right, interesting. Well, I recommend trying it out someday. You'll see it. You've used a couple calculators, Andy. Yeah, and I think you would probably notice when you're using those calculators that there's a lot of estimations that go into this process, right? And it was also one of the issues that we found that really needed a little bit of disruption. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, but also if what you're measuring is super imprecise, then you're not going to be able to do very much from that. And very different assumptions. Exactly. Yeah. And I actually, that's been one of them when you talk to executives that are not necessarily in the sustainability world, one of the things that makes it really click for them is if they've ever tried to offset one of their flights and realize that if you purchase an offset from one place, it's completely different from purchasing it from another place. And it begs the question, what's the actual truth behind all of this, right? Woodland Trust, I recently worked with, track their carbon footprint. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few companies out there trying to do this, and there's a couple different ways. Our view at Emitwise is that we want to make it easier to do it and better, to make it pretty simple. And like I said, it's there's a precision problem and there's a resource sink problem because it's a very manual spreadsheet driven process generally. So what do we do? And I'll try to blaze through this so that we actually have a bit more time for discussion. Let me take this question actually before I dive into how does Emitwise work. The question is, would you expect governments to put a price on carbon in the future so that companies have to actually accept financial penalties for emissions? This could be a way to economically enforce reductions of emissions. Yes, absolutely. Carbon credits, carbon taxes, carbon cap and trade schemes are already enacted around the world. The thing is that they're only really applied for heavy industry typically. So in Europe, if you're a cement producer, for example, you have to pay taxes on your carbon, and you have a limit of how much you can emit before you have to pay penalties. The problem with carbon pricing is that it's been really hard to set a price properly, to manage properly, and it can only be easily enforced on direct emissions. So when we were looking at this graph up here, It can only be enforced on what you're burning into the air and what you're using in the way of electricity, because there's very standard ways of tracking that. But supply chain emissions, which are the most material for most businesses, typically over 80% of the emissions of a particular business, are not typically regulated. And that's also a major problem that we see from a regulatory point of view. And in fact, that's one of the major issues that we try to solve at Emitwise. So basically, the core of our concept in terms of technology and software is that we take in data from businesses about what they're consuming in the way of products and services and goods and raw materials and energy and utilities. And we take that from their enterprise systems, from their accounting systems, from their energy management systems, waste management systems, enterprise resource planning systems. And we take in live data from their actual utility providers, and then we do all of the carbon accounting. And of course, we produce two things. Number one, we produce what they're already used to so that we can sell them today. We tell them, here's the same report that you would have produced yourself manually. But more importantly, we give them these live dashboards where they can actually go and dig into this data and use interesting analytics to understand where are my biggest emissions, where am I being carbon inefficient compared to other companies in my space, where am I being carbon efficient compared to different parts of my supply chain or different geographic locations in my business. All of these different questions that will allow them to better and more efficiently reduce their carbon emissions, essentially. And really where it gets super complex is in how the carbon accounting actually works. This is a snapshot that I took for you guys of one of the carbon accounting modules that we have for one of the types of emission sources that you would need to calculate. And the processes that you look at here are, for example, trying to understand the materiality of that source of emissions for my business by looking at just how much it accounts for and how important or relevant it is for my business model. It's about trying to source the relevant emissions factors. So I think it was Andy that said above that, yeah, Andy, you said there's very different assumptions when you were looking at the carbon calculators, and exactly finding the right assumption that is the most precise given your location, who you've purchased a certain thing from, et cetera, is one of the hardest problems in carbon accounting, and something that we're trying to really push the boundaries on using machine learning. And essentially what you actually see down here is, okay, well, once I've sourced all that information, we have to follow these protocols as to how you put it all together to give you the final result of what is the carbon emission associated with XYZ thing that my business is consuming or producing. It is it is a hard to scale process, and that's where the machine learning really comes in, both at the data input point about trying to automatically label data, automatically clean data, automatically map data to different elements. And it is a hard to scale process as well, from all of the different hierarchies of typically subjective decisions that people would be doing manually, that now we're trying to smartly and in a robust and compliant way automate. So Corinne is asking, do you find businesses are interested in reducing emissions and being more environmentally friendly, or are they mostly after compliance? That is an excellent question. In fact, let's jump into the next section, and then I'll come back onto my QA for tech later. The answer is twofold. Certainly pre-COVID, there was a strategic element to sustainability, and the biggest selling points that we were hearing were all about making shareholders happy, making consumers happy, and increasing the efficiency of how, for every dollar you spend, how many kilograms of CO2 can you reduce? Because businesses like Unilever have demonstrated directly the ROI of reducing your CO2 through things like revenue growth and increasing their competitive advantage. That being said, there's no doubt whatsoever that COVID has changed things. COVID has put a question mark on sustainability, and the businesses themselves don't know if it's still the same strategic element that it was literally a month ago. And Alejandro is adding, in regards to the capabilities of organizations, thank you, Corinne. Alejandro is adding, Yeah, so absolutely, Alejandro. So Alejandro's asking basically, depending on how sophisticated is your business and how big is the carbon footprint of your business, could do those businesses actually have influence over what kind of data needs to be collected, and what are the requirements around the data collection? Is that correct, Alejandro? Am I getting your question right? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, the answer is they do. They have influence in massive ways. On one side, actually influencing how the protocols around carbon accounting are written and developed and improved upon. And these are very sort of like public to private collaborative conversations. But on the other hand, actually influencing their supply chains, which is the biggest element. You know, these massive listed companies can go down to a supplier and tell them, if you don't tell me specifically what is the CO2 associated with every gram of corn that I buy from you, or every gram of copper that I buy from you, then I just will stop buying it from you. And so that's actually been really influential over the last couple of years. You've seen a lot of increased reporting, even from companies that wouldn't typically report, because their customers, which are large companies with a lot of influence, can tell them what they want to see data around. And just to, yeah, awesome, Alejandro. So let's tackle back actually for a second and just take, you know, because I'm conscious of time, we've got about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure that I can also let you guys speak more than me. I've already been speaking way too much. Is anybody interested in diving into the technology a little bit more? I know that you guys said you were more interested in the intersection of things. Does anybody have any questions or comments around sort of the more like, from a tech point of view, machine learning point of view, how does the carbon accounting work and how does the software work? I'll give it a second. No, if we have no questions or comments, I can crack on. You'd be interested in the machine learning aspect, Piero? Absolutely. Anything in particular? Tech plus one. Anything in particular, Piero? I don't know if since you've been so active. Oops, okay.
Yeah, no, I'm just interested. Can you hear me?
Yep, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, just interested in your stack, the kind of libraries that you use.
Yeah.
Do you open source your code? What kind of development practices you use? What do you find exciting on the, you know, more than 20 minutes, but you know, I suppose that's.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, unfortunately, we're in a position where we can open source anything, not because of competitive nature or anything like that, just because of the time sink associated with that. But we're all like, honestly, we can't wait until we have the time to do that. Because we very much want to peddle like more openness and transparency around how companies can do all of this. And the reality is that when it comes to tech, we're not reinventing the wheel or anything. We're using pretty standard stuff out there in the way of, you know, for example, NLP frameworks, the classics, to, you know, for example, automatically figure out that a transaction on an invoice or an accounting data set means that something is coffee and not water, or whatever that might be. So, you know, when it comes to our tech infrastructure, the most interesting insight that I can give you is that we're not developing deep technology when it comes to machine learning. We're applying the latest and the most interesting stuff in order to create this interesting carbon accounting system. To be frank, our USP and our sort of secret sauce is actually the carbon accounting mechanism itself, and how do you scale it, right? How do you take something that would have traditionally taken one consultant 6 months of crawling through the data and you know, softwareize that process essentially. And the question of how do you help companies get insights into that gray area of indirect emissions is actually really important, because it's the hardest question of all. They are the most material, and not just for tech and startups, Lee, but for most sort of like non-heavy industry or manufacturing businesses, you know, for legal firms, for professional services firms, for accounting firms, for, you know, mom and dad shops. And I have two answers for you, Lee. On one side, you can use Emitwise Starter, which is our entry point level product, and makes it extremely easy to, as a company that doesn't have a sustainability team, doesn't have a sustainability manager, to just get an overview of your carbon footprint. And exactly the reason we built the Emitwise Starter is because we knew that without a sustainability team, it's prohibitively, you know, it's impossible to actually sort of get started. What you need to look at in order to map your indirect emissions, by the way, is just what are you spending money on? You know, if you look at your accounting sheet and you see how much you've spent on flights, you see how much you've spent on servers, you see how much you spent on food, you can already start building a pretty good map. And it won't be the most precise map ever. If you want really the precision that, for example, a big enterprise would need, you need access to other data systems that will tell you, well, specifically which flight did you take, and, you know, when, you know, well, did you fly coach or business, and all of these different elements that you can induce sometimes, but, you know, not with the highest precision ever. to finalize your question above, and how do we actually help them get insights about the indirect emissions? Well, basically what our software does is just try to present it to you in a way that makes sense, right? So let me just scroll back to the very top, where we show this very simple example of converting your business travel emissions and how many trees worth of CO2 produced every year that is. And we have more interesting conversions, like how many miles driven that is, how many flights from London to New York does it equate, and that first level of understanding, honestly, when you first map your carbon footprint and you get that holy shit moment, I had no idea that I'm consuming 5 flights a year worth of food related emissions, for example, or whatever that might be, is a first step towards really realizing the level of action and sort of impact that you can have. I saw that there was a QA. So Sophie says, given women and girls are disproportionately impacted in climate change globally, if more businesses are actually tracking the footprint, we're also sure that they are also to improve on the prevention and clarity. Like business accounts need to show sustainability and efforts. Yeah, that's an incredible question, Sophie. So Sophie's talking about, I'm not sure if everybody can see it, so I'll repeat it just in case, that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, and as are other minority groups, very sadly across the world. And so there's a question here about how, if businesses are more actively tracking their environmental impact, should they also be looking at gender equality at the same place and basically try to drive progress on both ends simultaneously? I hope I got your question right, Sophie. Let me know if I didn't. And my answer to that is absolutely. And again, one of the cool things about working on a company like Emitwise is that you get to learn a lot about what large businesses are doing in the way of ESG, environmental, social, and governance of sustainability. And that social element is super important. To be frank, it's something that I'm extremely passionate about myself. In terms of how we interact with that as Emitwise, we are always the first to say that we're laser focused on just carbon footprinting, because it's such a meaty problem of its own. But there are really great technologies out there in the way of social sustainability as well. A really cool one that's I'm a big fan of is Provenance, which helps you understand the social elements of businesses' supply chains. The relationship between reduced carbon footprint and increased inequality, given the yeah, absolutely. I don't have data on the relationship itself, Sophie. I'd actually really love to dig into it, so I might do a little bit of research, and then I'll see if I can show you anything that I find. And please do send me any links that you have. I'll give you my email at the end of this conversation. But it's one of those elements that, as I think with everything else, businesses are starting to realize that there's a real strong ROI for them behind being a socially sustainable business as well, which is super important. And the people from Providence would be the best people to speak with about that. Excellent, will do. Awesome, Sophie. Thank you for that question and comment. Let me just scroll right back down. And what did I have after this? Now the scary news. Let's dive into, somebody said that they wanted a little bit more data around that initial statement that I did in regards to the CO2 emissions reductions thanks to COVID. So this is the link, and in fact, I'll put it on the chat right now. I definitely think it's worth a read, so that you guys can check it out and I don't forget it later. Whoops, I sent you the wrong link. Let's see if I can pick it up real quick. There we go. So it's really that simple, guys. We're not flying right now. Shipping rates have fallen. I'm sure you guys all saw that oil price got negative last week. It's extremely clear to everybody, I'm sure, just how disruptive the current state of affairs is, and the fact that this is the level of change that is required in order to actually have a healthy planet over the next 50 to 100 years. For me, frankly, it's terrifying. As a lover of nature, the idea of that a lot of the most beautiful habitats in the world that I haven't yet been able to see and I want to see will be destroyed is sad. But at the same time, I know that the planet will outlive us, right? I think the thing about climate change that really saddens me and the most and gives me the most urgency is that human element of it. It's the fact that, and I put it down here as a statement because I think it's worth highlighting. Really, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die, millions, tens of millions of people are going to be displaced. And it's one really must think about the individual stories, right? That son, that daughter, that mother, that will see their loved ones die because they were flooded, or they were affected by a natural disaster. And the fact is that we need to maintain the current level of emissions reductions. That really tells us that everyone in this call needs to go and make sure that their business, alongside with whatever their primary activity is doing, is also aligned with reducing emissions in some capacity, whatever that might be. Maybe that is just telling the airlines that you fly with that they have to offset the emissions of every flight that they take, or talking to your office suppliers, supplies, companies that you work with, and telling them like, hey, I'm not going to buy pens from you unless I know that they're carbon neutral pens. Everything that we do needs to be related to climate change if we want to have some sort of hope whatsoever. And I think we all want to have hope. So I hope that serves as a call to action. We have 10 minutes left for discussion, and you guys have already had a lot of ideas throughout the conversation. So that was all I wanted to sort of blurt out. Why don't we open it up again, and maybe we can just unmute a lot of the microphones and just have a bit of a chat. Awesome. The UN is less optimistic, says Lee Baker. I'm gonna leave that read for later in the week when I've got the emotional energy for it, Lee. But I'll go ahead and actually save it on this chat for a later time. So let's discuss. I'm curious, in particular, Pierre, you were already chatting quite a bit. What is everybody doing? Does anybody have like interesting lessons about things that they've been able to do? Ryan is asking, what else do you think is great work? Who else do you think is doing great work in this space? You see, so many examples, to be honest, Ryan. I love some of the offsetting initiatives that are happening. I think offsetting is very much a double-edged sword, but I love what it's done in the way of engaging people. So the guys at Pachama and at Project Ren, you can also call out companies that suck if you want to. I mean, I think, so when we were doing that first analysis that I told you, that we were looking through the data of carbon footprints reported by the FTSE listed companies, you get to really easily figure out which are the companies that care and which are the ones that don't. Because when you've read 200 annual reports, you can tell which are the ones that are actually trying to reduce emissions and which are the ones that don't give a crap. And honestly, Weatherspoons was one of the ones that really stuck with me, that they just couldn't care less. They literally put a little section that small in one of the pages about the data around their climate change, and didn't even make a comment around it. But that's unfair to them, because the reality is that unfortunately it's the vast majority of companies that are not doing enough. I want to learn something. I want to do this year is learn a lot more about disruptive technologies, particularly around energy, and nuclear is something that I'm very, very interested in. So actually, if there's anyone in here that knows a little bit about that and has some pointers, like, please send them my way, because that I think that's an element that will be so crucial. And carbon capture as well. There was some really amazing research coming out last year around in the world of carbon capture. What about you, Ryan? Do you have any companies that you think are great? Or Woodland, let's see, Sophie says Woodland Trust use carbon independence calculator and Eco Passenger. We've got to work for a corporate travel company, and we're trying to transition to a sustainable way of doing business. That includes internal activities and those of our customers. Any good suggestions for the corporate travel sector? Yes, absolutely. I mean, you guys are massively influential. I can tell you that a lot of the customers that we are talking to, one of the major things that they want is better data from their travel agents about what is the emissions associated with their flights, with their business travel. So the first thing that you guys should do is make sure that you're providing that to your own customers. Am I understanding correctly? You essentially sell, flights and business travel packages to corporate customers? Yes, perfect. So We should chat after this. Please like send me an email, and you know, it's not necessarily something that we might do. Maybe you'll want to set it up yourself, but that will be really powerful, and I think it will give you a lot of business, to be honest, especially with the post-COVID world. You're doing some reporting already, but you need to do more. Fantastic. Awesome. That's super great. That's super great. Anybody else out there? Let's see. Ryan, you mentioned energy, nuclear, different topic, I guess, but I guess you're pro-nuclear, and I have been following up what the Gates Foundation has been up to. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as declaring myself as a pro-nuclear, but yeah, I'm not anti-nuclear either. I think, as with everything else, it's a tool in the toolkit. I actually haven't been following up with what the Gates Foundation has been up to. What's the latest, Ryan?
Yeah, so actually, it appeared in a recent Netflix documentary with Bill Gates.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big project that he was the foundation was collaborating with the Chinese government to basically implement a new type of nuclear reactor, but it got blocked as part of the Trump administration's blocks on trade with China.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I need to look into this. I did see, is that the same documentary where Bill Gates talks about the toilets, the loos?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's called Inside Bill's Brain.
Inside Bill's Brain. Yeah, I should take that up again. I haven't been watching much Netflix these days, I've got to say. Cool. We've got Corinne saying, you have to dash, unfortunately. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Please do, you know, shoot me an email if there's anything you want to chat about. And otherwise, like, it's been awesome to be able to have a chat. But yeah, thank you for participating. My email is, in fact, I've got it right here, but I'll put it for you guys as well. emitwise.com. Thank you, Andy. Thank you. I guess we're sort of wrapping up, unless anybody has any other sort of like major points of discussion that's interesting, or questions for me, or things I can send your way, people I can send your way, anything you're looking to learn about that I might be able to help with at all.
Maybe one question. So I suppose we've talked a bit about quite a lot about business, and not that much about government. How much support does this kind of industry of tracking get from the government? I mean, is there more that you're trying to get, or would like to be able to lobby to get?
Yeah, again, awesome question. I think quite a bit in the way of soft support, a lot of structure and frameworks, and the UK in particular. Sorry, BEIS, you know, publishes a lot of sort of like protocols and guidance on how businesses should do these things. But in our specific space of emissions tracking, not all that much, to be frank, in the way of like genuine financial support, grants. You don't see the same level of massive grants that you see for things like, you know, let's develop the next generation of solar panels. And I think it makes sense from a certain point of view. Like, this is not a super capital intensive sector, like, you know, unlike developing some new clean energy technology. But at the same time, I think it would be good to see a little bit more dollars behind all of this, because it's a fundamental pillar behind the climate movement. Before I get to your question, Sophie, sorry, let me just really quickly go through Alejandro's. There's a bit of a rabbit hole. Ethical, philosophical foundations of various nations, Eastern one. Are there any topics related to that point that could be reflected in the way of societies operate, specifically in regards to how organizations enforce limits, requirements, and carbon footprint emissions? Alejandro, I want to make sure that I get your question right, but it's sort of like a little bit about how do the different philosophies of different regions and sort of you know, parts of the world are reflected in how they think about their carbon footprint and how they actually like look to reduce it. Is that sort of correct?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So yeah, so basically, I mean, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but we've discussed in other sessions things like the philosophical foundations of, you know, East and West, and then try to like get some insights of you know, how that perhaps would reflect into ways that now can be seen, perhaps on a political level or just on a national level. Whether the way that carbon footprints limits and requirements are enforced, have you seen that you know, specific political or even more foundational perspectives have driven that mentality. Say perhaps that you're saying that China, even though they're a developing country and they're growing really fast, they know that they have to, but they still have been quite aggressive in the way that they approach it. Whereas perhaps, some, Western countries, not to name any, they want to revive coal. So I don't know if you have seen anything around that.
Yeah. I mean, more anecdotally than anything, to be frank, when you talk to people from different places about this, you can instantly see the way that they position the problem in their head is probably very much aligned with their sort of like, as you say, philosophical foundation. To be frank, it's quite inspiring to see how most people in the UK think about these problems. They tend to really come from a point of, this genuinely matters to the world, and this is something that we really need to care about, rather than just sort of like check it off and sort it out. But I'm Latin American. I'm guessing you're Latin American as well, Alejandro. Unfortunately, when you still talk to a lot of South American companies, the only reason they're interested in chatting with you is because of that compliance element. Interestingly enough, in the US, which I anticipate maybe that Western country, what you actually hear is a lot of a bit of a pushback on the current administration stance on all of this. And companies that previously wouldn't have been doing much, out of fear that enough won't happen, are starting to be more proactive. But of course, at the same time, that may very well be affected by the fact that I live in a little bit of a bubble in this world. And I haven't really looked at the data of how many corporates in the US have done more or less since the current administration. So I think that's an awesome question. I don't have enough information around it, Alejandro, but I think it's something definitely worth sort of like learning a little bit more about.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Sophie was chatting about, I'm mindful, I don't have a hard stop, guys. Like, of course, if you need to drop off, go ahead, but we should chat about these last couple of points. Sophie was saying strategic partnership opportunities between Emitwise, government funding, and NGOs. We're constantly looking for them and exploring. One of the core parts of our company is that we're a partnership-driven business. It's part of our business model. So we work very closely with consultancies, both like that are in the sustainability space, but just general consultancies, where we like started conversations that are in very early stages. Like, I'm making no claims, but for example, we've been able to speak to the CDC, and so those conversations, we hope, are very early stages before we can actually start actively collaborating with the public bodies that are enforcing regulation on the companies. And it's just to be able to show them that with more technology and tools like Emitwise, they'll be able to enforce more and push companies to report more and require reductions rather than suggest them and things like that. Thank you, Piero. Thank you so much. Drop me a line. Sounds like we could do a lot of interesting conversations. And if you're interested in learning more about the tech, I can plug you into my tech co-founders. Cheers, Piero. Ryan said, seems to be a lot of people from the call from a travel background. Any companies or practices, trends you'd like to mention that you think are promising or important for travel and climate impact? Well, I can definitely give a shout out to Capgemini here. Capgemini is doing some really cool things in the way of corporate travel. They track the travel emissions associated with specific sales accounts that they have, and they did a super cool sort of like public report on this, where they show how they were able to use that information to engage different account managers to just travel less, essentially, by showing them the environmental impact of what they do. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for your participation. Your company serves Capgemini. There you go. So they must be asking you for travel data, and they're doing a lot of good stuff with that data. And the cool thing is that they're also now engaging their customers around all of the sustainability, the sustainability work that they've been able to do inside. Yeah, I can imagine that is a intensive customer to supply to, but they're great. I love the Capgemini guys. We're trying to work with them very, very actively, but we're in the early days of that conversation as well. Awesome, guys. This has been such a cool little chat. I'm glad that we were able to get the chat going. It's always a little bit hard to get the discussions going. More than happy to take an extra 5 minutes if there's a few more bits and bobs that anybody would like to chat about. Otherwise, like I said, you've got my LinkedIn and my email here, and more generally, like, it's really cool to now sort of be a part of this community. If you guys will accept me, I'll definitely be trying to join like any future webinars that you guys do, and also form a part of the discussion there.
We should definitely chat afterwards. See if there's any speakers you'd like to recommend for future sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of good ones in mind for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've actually just noticed that I missed a couple of the Q&As. Oh no, it's just Sophie's from earlier. Cool. Awesome.
Cool. Well, thanks very much for joining us and for handling the question so well.
It was interesting. I was learning it on the fly. First time that I do something like this, and especially running it on Notion. It was interesting. Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate everyone's time. I hope you go out and enjoy the sunny day, and more importantly, I hope that you go out and do a lot all of the time about climate change. Think about it every day. It's the most important thing in our world. Awesome.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.